you were born December 1951. You're a Sagittarius. Do you identify with that at all, or do you think astrology is just hooey?
Well, you commented, didn't you, that there seem to be more Sagittarians amongst the people you're interviewing. So that's in the direction of what I would call empirical data.
Thank you.
So I think this is about science, isn't it? And we need to keep an open mind and try to study these things. I mean, it makes sense. Actually, I was thinking about it because Sagittarius classically is the arrow, the bow. It's projecting into the future, looking into the future, long journey. So it kind of fits with what you're trying to select.
Right. So, and I asked a friend of mine who's a professional astrologer, and she said Sagittarius ask deep questions. So that's another component.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's all within the symbolism of Sagittarius. So I keep an open mind of these things, but one of the things that I'm very interested in, I'm sure this will come out as we talk further, are these more sort of Gnostic systems, the Kabbalah, which connects with astrology, and the notion that there are deep patterns that are important to us in our lives. And I think that's where astrology lies. But as for how it operates, I mean, that's another kind of question.
Nobody knows.
I mean, maybe it could be that just being born at a particular time in terms of the seasons, that kind of thing, does have an influence. And the fact that it was projected up onto the heavens, the stars, that may not be the causative part of it. It's just good observation. I don't know. Keep an open mind.
Right, and the proof is in the pudding, and it seems to have some usefulness, especially if you look at the whole chart, not just where the sun is.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I've done some of that.
And, do you know what you have rising and your moon and that kind of thing?
I have Gemini rising. And the moon is in Pisces.
Ah, I'm a Gemini. There's lots of Pisceans, too, which makes sense because they're intuitive and sensitive.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. I'm also interested in the typology of the Myersbriggs. As a psychologist, yeah. I'm hoping that you'll know yours.
Well, okay, so I didn't know mine. I mean, I'm very interested in Jung, interested in Jung.
Yeah.
But I've never been a great fan of questionnaire kind of basis for typology. So, but you sent a link, so I went through it.
Yay.
For yours. ENFP.
See, now that's perfect because P's do not like these kind of tests at all. Because they have to be put in boxes. As a J, I love them. They're so meaningful to me. And this is about so far only one person is an S, everyone else is an N, and there's a lot of P's. And P's like open options, and J's like to check things off their list and move forward. So it looks like there is kind of a profile of people who are intuitive and like open options.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So I'm wondering, you've taught in Israel, in the U.S., obviously in the U.K. Do you find that you kind of shift your approach depending on what nationality you're teaching?
This is an interesting question. It's not just a question of teaching in one particular area, because the teaching I do now, you probably know, and I run online programs through the Alef Trust, and we've got students all around the world. So, I might be teaching at the same time someone from China, someone from the States, someone from Europe, So, and there are differences, yes, very much so. But let's stay with the question the way you asked it, okay? And the answer to that is yes. So, for example, when I've taught in Israel, it's been very much on the basis of my own interests in a particular system. That's the Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and relating that to psychology. And so with an audience there, I can take more for granted in that area. Yeah, obviously, many people in the audience will be Jewish and they've explored these areas themselves. And then a difference with America, for example, I think that Americans are much more interested in experience. They're much more. There's a certain creative exploration there, which it sounds like a cliche, but I think it's true. I think we have in Europe and UK in particular, there's perhaps more reserved quality. So maybe I jump into things a little bit more spontaneously with the US audience. Yeah, It's all good fun. Keeps me on my toes.
Yeah. I've taught a lot of my clairvoyant and healing workshops in Japan, and it was so different there because I really had to stand on my head to get them to start talking. Exactly. But after a while, then it was like so it was wonderful. But
I find that too. And as I say, I haven't taught in Japan. But with the classes we're running now online, we have people from different areas, and the eastern areas they're not so immediate to get into this sort of explorative mindset, which I think is so important with transpersonal psychology.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned the trust that you and your wife founded. Could you say a word about that now, because I want to make sure we talk about it?
Sure, yeah. Well, we set it up, I think it's about 7 or 8 years ago now, when I left the university. So I was a professor at Liverpool John Moores University. I think I'm the only professor of transpersonal psychology in the UK. Wow. So I think I was the first, so that was quite a thing. So, and now I'm Professor Emeritus. But anyway, there were various reasons why I felt that the work I'd done at the university, coming to an end. There were other pressures, like, the university was becoming much more of a marketplace, and I thought the values that I went into it with, many years back, those values were changing, and I thought I could do it through an independent organisation better. It's not so easy to run these topics that interest me, like transpersonal psychology, the mystical areas, and so on, in connection with psychology. It's not mainstream psychology, So I did that through the university. I mean, it's not like in the States. I think you have more specialized institutes, like CIIS and so on. Whereas I was working here in mainstream universities, and so I was sort of in a bit of a niche area, and so it felt to me like the time was right to launch an independent organisation through which we can offer programs of study which are validated or accredited by the university. So it gives us a little bit more independence. So yes, the Alef Trust, it's our interest is in areas of spirituality, consciousness studies. My background in neuroscience links into that, but I'm also interested in mysticism. So these areas of transpersonal psychology. And the other point about that move was, I'd done a lot. I was one of the pioneers at my university to develop online learning, and I just felt that this was the way of the future, and I wanted to develop that more, which was what we've done with the Alef Trust. So we have students and staff. I mean, that's the other thing. I'm not restricted to those who happen to be sitting in a particular university. So we have tutors from the States, we have tutors from South Africa, from other areas in Europe, and students from all around the world. And it's very, very exciting. It's very exciting, yeah.
So do you give your lectures live, or do you just tape them and they tune in when they want? And then they email questions, or how does it work?
So, in my heart of hearts, I'm a teacher. That's what I really love doing. I mean, obviously, I'm sure we talk, I've done writing, I've done research, etc. But it's that, when you're with someone or group and you see a light going on in someone's eyes.
Yes, or they laugh at your joke.
Yes, exactly. So there's a great deal you can do online, and you can have that direct contact, like we are now. Yeah, we're doing that now. So, okay, online maybe the energy flows are a little bit different, but you still have that quality of teaching. So, in answer to your question, we really emphasize the community side of what we're doing and the importance of being present. So, I certainly don't just throw a lecture online and say, okay, there it is, off we go, do something and give me an essay or whatever. No, so we run live webinars. We use a learning interface, which are quite well known these days, these online interfaces. So we have forums that are asynchronous. We have the webinars that are in real time. We have, on the interface, I've got obviously a lot of scholarly material, and I give students guidance for that. It's a very complex array, and obviously I would show it to you, but I think that would detract us a little much. But if you were to sit down with me and I could show you everything we have online, you'd be impressed. It's really very rich, and the proof of the pudding. That's a UK expression. I don't know if you use that in the States.
We do.
It's in the eating. That is, we get amazing feedback from our students. Our students, when they graduate, they don't want to leave. They want to stay with us. They stay in the community, so they kind of become buddies with other students, or, we have a great community. And I think that's at the core of what I do, to build community. It's all very well to look at the recent research and visionary scientific ideas, which I know that you're interested in. I teach a lot on consciousness and mysticism, but the bottom line is that we're creating a community, and I think that those who join our community, they're searching for like-minded people, and there's a lot of people who are interested in spirituality these days, for example, but with a view to a kind of scholarly side to it. So, we do have, there's an academic backbone. In our programs, you were very interested in the transformative side of education and people's individual practices, for example, which are crucial in the transpersonal spiritual area. But at the same time, our courses are validated by mainstream UK universities. And, we can't get away with just some sort of lazy thinking. There's a real academic core. Yeah.
And then,
so I think that's what brings people together. That's what brings people together. This sense of the shared interest in the sort of renewal of spirituality, which is very distinctive in our day, together with a kind of a backbone of academic rigor.
Do they get a master's degree? What kind of degrees do you offer?
No, it's all postgraduate. So we're running a master's and MSc. We're running an MSc in consciousness, spirituality, and transpersonal psychology, and we have students doing PhDs in these areas as well.
Oh wow! Oh, that's interesting. Do you trace the renewed interest in spirituality to this 1960s, or when do you think a renewed interest came about?
The 60s was a very important era. I was growing up in the 60s, so I think it was influential on me. Here I am in Liverpool. When I say I'm from Liverpool, people mention one or two things. Either Beatles or the football, but here in this context it's the Beatles. I mean, it was an era of exploration, and I'm very interested in patterns over history, and I'm talking on long scale, like Renaissance and going back, especially in the area of Kabbalah, Gnosticism. All there's some very interesting patterns. Maybe we can talk about that in more detail, but certainly you can only understand the 60s if you understand the 50s. And the 50s was so much about the end of the war in this country, probably in the States as well. So there's such major shifts. And the 20th century, essentially it was one long war.
Mm-hmm.
The Second World War, we call it the Second World War, but it was a continuation in many ways. It was a consequence of the First World War. And the First World War was very much about a change of era. Yeah? And the way that, I don't think it's our subject for now, but it's an important thing, the mechanization that came in and how consciousness revolves around these kind of leaps that are happening in society, in technology, for example. So I think, in answer to your question, the seeds are in the 50s, but the seeds go back in the way I've been saying. The Beat Generation, things that were happening in the 50s, but it flowers in the 60s. That's the point.
What's interesting? You make me think of Alvin Toffler, the futurist, who says he traces everything, the big changes to technology, from agriculture to industrial revolution to computer and information era. So do you agree that that's foundational, technological changes?
Definitely, and as a psychologist in particular, because the way we conceive of the mind, the way the mind works, again, you can trace it historically. It's always been fed by the technology, the forefront of technology in the culture. So there was a time when, trace it back to the early years of sort of pneumatic theory. The nerves are conducting fluids and so on. So that was a model on the basis of fluids and gases and that kind of thing. And that goes way back to Galen, Roman, or this sort of telephone exchange analogy. The brain is like a super telephone exchange. And then we have a computer, so now the brain is a computer, a hologram. So definitely, there's this complex interplay between research in science, and particularly here psychology, and developments in the culture. There's no ivory towers here. We're part of the evolution of culture. And so what was happening in the 60s, it was very much an exploration when the lid came off, as it were.
Right. And transpersonal psychology, I think, was influenced by Eastern religions that became popular with the Beatles in the 60s and that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And one of the things one of the areas I looked at is the interesting parallels between our age and the early Renaissance. So the Renaissance, the classic flowering, obviously, everyone knows about that. But what triggered that? What triggered that explorative spirit, which is so critical to the development of history, of art, of philosophy, etc. And when you look at the trigger, the triggering items, you see parallels in our day. So, for example, it was the great explorers, discovery of America, the great voyages of discovery, paralleling in the 60s is the space race, exploring beyond the Earth. A crucial thing for the Renaissance was printing, development of printing, which again that was explosive. The impact of printing. And in our, the parallel for us is the internet. It's a quantum leap in terms of dissemination of information, just like the discovery of printing was. And you mentioned about the Eastern religions. So in the early Renaissance, a number of the major thinkers, Christian thinkers, what triggered their creativity was them encountering Islamic and Jewish philosophy and mysticism in that period. And what parallels that today? Of course, it's the same kind of innovative input, this time from the Eastern traditions. Mm-hmm. And that's always the way, isn't it?
Right. I'm thinking
creativity. Creativity comes from discovering something that is new to you. So when you encounter a new tradition, a culture is opened up for the first time, there's a creative explosion.
Let's go back to your personal history. Was your background Jewish? Were you raised in a Jewish family?
Yes, I'm Jewish by birth, and I grew up in not a strongly Jewish environment. For example, I think I was the only Jewish child in the school where I was. But, my parents were very traditional. I mean, I didn't know anything about the mysticism. Yeah, we'd celebrated Jewish festival, that kind of thing. So it wasn't an intensely religious upbringing. But, you get, I think this is the point about, identifying with the Jewish religion. It's not so much just religion, it's about the culture. So, I grew up in that culture, but not a very religious sense of that culture, if you see what I mean.
I would say a quarter of the scientists that I've interviewed have the same kind of Jewish background, that they weren't particularly religious, they were Reformed Jews, maybe they weren't even bar mitzvahed, but that's more than the population of the percentage of Jews.
Hugely more.
Yeah.
Hugely more, yeah.
So what is there about that culture that encourages people to be such innovators?
How long have we got? It's due to several factors. One, I'll keep this really brief, but it is a very big subject and a very interesting subject. Actually, Jewish history is fascinating.
Yeah.
So one of the factors is the tradition of learning. It's a central value in Judaism is that of learning, of education. Historically speaking, Jewish kids were getting an education when those around them, there was no idea of them going to school or anything like that. So there is a very strong tradition of education, and there are specific aspects to the Jewish tradition which are bound up with it being a kind of minority culture in exile, right? So the Jewish mind, we're going back hundreds of years, of course. This is a long-standing formative stage, as it were. The Jewish mind was always looking through the cracks, as it were, right? So because it was because of the kind of anti-Semitic pressures, Jewish books were burned, Jewish communities were isolated. There was, it was a hugely, subject anti-Semitism historically is a whole big subject which I can't go into, but the people were not able to enter mainstream culture, and they developed a kind of secret culture. And part of that secret culture was the idea of penetrating beneath the surface of things. Yeah, so a work like the Talmud, which is the central text of Jewish learning for thousands of years, it's always about looking under the surface. So the scripture, the Torah. Let's see, there's a statement there. Moses said such and such, or whatever it was. And the tradition of learning was always to look between the cracks. What's going on? Why did he say that way? Why is this particular letter there? Why is this word used? I think all these, really almost esoteric ideas became practically mainstream in Jewish tradition. So that spirit of exploration was a mainstream value. Now, obviously, if we go back hundreds of years, it was really channeled within the religion, the scriptures, and the philosophical learning, and so on. But I think in the modern era, that sense of exploration, of looking through the cracks, it's something that we have as a heritage. And of course, then people moving away from religion, the same spirit comes out in things like physics, and psychology. physics and
Einstein.
psychology. It's huge, numbers of Jews that are involved in seminal discoveries there. So it's interesting. I mean, I don't like the kind of, this, like the chosen people, and, I mean, it's not a pejorative thing. It's just a product of history. And, we will share that history today. So, for example, if I'm running a class on Kabbalah, for example, which is classically those ideas, that sort of notion of appearing within the cracks, as Leonard Cohen put it, see where the light comes in. Yeah. If I'm running such a class, many people are not Jewish, and I think that's the point. It's like you said about the influence of Eastern traditions. We're living in a different age, and it's all about sharing these great ideas, and of course that's what transpersonal psychology is very much about.
You know what makes me think of is Asian students who are immigrants, or they also have the tradition of learning and scholarship, and they do very well. In the States, it's an issue because they get admitted more to university, and then some schools say, oh, well, we don't want to have this many percentage of Asian students, but I don't have any Asian visionary scientists. So there's something about their culture that made them excel academically, but not go towards the pioneering.
I think you're right. Yeah, you're right. And I teach Asian people, and I recognise what you're saying. And I think again, there's so many factors in this. So, for example, one factor is the experience of being an immigrant. So, my grandparents were immigrants to the UK. So my parents are first generation, and a shared value amongst the first generation is to ensure that the second generation, i.e. me, they integrate, they excel. It's this crazy cliche about becoming doctors and lawyers, all that kind of thing. And that's what we're seeing with the Asian, same generational structure there. I think the point of difference with Jewish history is that point about being in exile. So again, it's just too much to go into what the Jewish history as such, but you probably know. So obviously, Jewish history, modern Jewish history, in a sense, starts with the destruction of the temple, the Roman conquest of Jerusalem, right, in sort of 2,000 years back, and a very distinctive feature, which of course you don't get with these Asian traditions in the same way, is the rise of Christianity. So, from the ashes of the temple, what arises is a new religion, which of course is the religion of Jesus, Christianity, and a reformulated notion of Judaism. What we call Judaism as a religion, inverted commas, we can't really call it that if we go back beyond 2,000 years. It was a temple-based cult in some ways, using sacrifice and that kind of thing. You talk about astrology early on. It's like there are these great ages. That's one of the ideas that astrology talks about. So 2,000 years ago there was a shift in the age, and I think the movements that gave rise to Christianity and the reformulation of Judaism, what we call rabbinic Judaism, they are symptomatic of that huge shift in the culture. But what then happened is that there's a kind of intense rivalry between these two religions, Christianity and Judaism. And of course, Christianity is the dominant, and the history. You've got a huge history in Europe. I mean, Jews were in other countries as well, of course, very early in China and India and so on. But, the line towards Western philosophy and the development of modern science is in that sense coming through Europe. And that's where you get this incredible experience of exile, where the Jewish communities were the minority, and they were subject to great persecution. and I think that shaped a certain form of the Jewish intellect.
Interesting.
But, yeah, I didn't expect we'd be talking about that.
You never know. With Geminis, things can move around. One of the questions I'm asking people is birth order, because someone told me about a book, Rebel Scientists, that found they were later born. What's your birth order?
I was third of 3.
Okay. But so far I'm not finding much of a pattern. We'll see. And then,
but I've that, I guess. From what you just said, you said the later born. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the idea was they can be more creative because there's not as much pressure on them to fit the firstborn achiever traditional mode.
Yeah.
Then why did you decide to go to university and study psychology and go on to graduate school?
So, okay. You know how when you're a child, people say, "Oh, what are you going to do when you grow up?"
Yeah.
So I had an answer, which was always, it was going to be medicine. Yeah, I was going to do be a doctor, and I was really always fascinated by the workings of the body. I studied, zoology, animals, but humans, and I was actually, I remember this very well. It's one of these big memories. I was applying for university to do medicine, and I had the form in front of me, and I kind of stopped. So this is how old was I? 17, I suppose, 16, 17. I stopped and thought, well, why am I doing this? And it was that thing that, people ask, what do you want to be? Oh, I'm going to be a doctor. Yeah, fine. It was like just had its own momentum. And I suddenly stopped and thought, actually, is that what I want to do? And again, and so what came in at that point? And it was that the subjects I've been doing to kind of move into medicine, I really was interested in physiology. How does the body work? That really interested me. But the thing that came in at that point was psychology. And I thought, I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to be sitting in a GP clinic, a physician's clinic, just meeting crazy people and writing prescriptions or whatever it is. And I wanted to understand the mind. That's what it was. I wanted to understand the mind. And that's fired me ever since, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Before we get into that, I want to ask everyone, when have been the most difficult times in your life and how did you cope? So other people can kind of learn from that.
Well, there are certain things that are distinctive to me because of a handicap that I have. I don't think it's a handicap, actually. So I was born with a facial paralysis, which has been with me through my life, right? So you may be able to see that. There were a number of consequences from that. So, for example, when I was very young, I had difficulty speaking. And in fact, so much so that when I started school, I guess I was 4, 5, I couldn't say my name. So I couldn't get labials, where the lips come together because of paralysis on this side of my face. And my first name was Brian, with a B. And my father had a genius idea, actually. So I was given 2 names of birth, Brian and Leslie. Of course, Leslie doesn't have any labials. So that's a story in itself, actually. And I think it was a big formative influence. I reflected back on this, right? What is it not to be able to say your name? Think about that. And then also the point about speech. I mean, so I remember, again, some memories are very strong. I remember the speech therapist I used to go to. And, it's amazing when I look back, because, of course, I've made my whole life around speaking. Yeah? I'm a lecturer. And so that's quite... So I think I had a big challenge, and, of course, the sense of the cosmetic side of things, when you're an adolescent, those kinds of things. I think there were some real challenges in my life, which you probably don't generalise, because that's a particular way I was born, as it were. I think that if I were to really analyse the motivating factors in my life, that's a big one. But there are others. Moving upwards in time, as it were, trying to, having a sense of the importance of spirituality, which, I first encountered a teacher of the Kabbalah when I was in my early 20s, and it made a big, big impact on me. And I wasn't religious at that point. I don't know if I'm religious now. Actually, that's an interesting question, but let's leave that for the moment. That had a big impact on me, and it was the time that I was, beginning my adult life, as it were. I mean, there are early 20s, so I was trying to move in a career direction. So I'd studied psychology, I'd studied physiology and psychology, 2 subjects at undergraduate level, and I was going on to do research. And so I was in the psychology department doing research, and this is in the early 70s. And the idea that anything mystical or spiritual would be in any way whatsoever relevant to what goes on in psychology was absolutely out of bounds. So, it's like I had a day job and a night job, and never the twain would meet. So in a sense, that was a challenge to persevere, and I always had the sense that there was a way in which these would come together, but it wasn't. I mean, the study of consciousness, which was really what I was interested in, back in the 60s and 70s, the study of consciousness was unheard of in psychology, in mainstream psychology, as it were. I think I set up an undergraduate course studying consciousness. I don't even think it was in the late 70s. It was probably the first one in the UK, or one of the first ones. Yeah. And I remember, and again, so I was quite young, late 20s, whatever it was. I remember being grilled in order to bring in a new course with a class, as it were, to say in the States, a new class in the university environment. You don't just sort of suddenly turn up and do it. It has to go through these boards. And I remember sitting in this board, and I was quite young, and they were always kind of old, grey old men, as I thought of them, and they were men, I have to add, and they didn't get it. They didn't get it, but I think put it this way, it was passed, so maybe I persuaded them. But there were some challenges there.
Some people say that having children is a real challenge, especially for the adult relationship.
Me having children?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've had 2 families, actually, in my life. So I have 2 children from a first marriage, and I have now, currently a 9-year-old, and I love them all, and I wouldn't exchange anything. But yeah, if I'm trying to write the great work, the one that will get the Nobel Prize, but I do have to give the bedtime story. There's no question. Which is the priority.
Bedtime story.
Absolutely.
That's great. So, you met a Kabbalah teacher, but how did you find transpersonal psychology?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, so I was at a university. Actually, we called it a polytechnic. It doesn't matter because it was an educational institution, and it just so happened that I had a colleague there. Yeah, both of us. We were in psychology. A good colleague. His name was Mike. We were appointed in psychology not for anything to do with transpersonal consciousness, spirituality, nothing like that. It just wouldn't have happened. He was an expert in moral development, child development. My area was neuroscience. But it happened that we had these interests. So he was very interested in transpersonal psychology, and we were able to set up a postgraduate program in consciousness and transpersonal psychology. So really, I think it was through him I came to realize there was a sort of discipline of transpersonal psychology. My background was more interest in mysticism and the practice. I mean, that was so it's really exploring in a practical way the nature of mind and spirituality on one side, and on the other, I by that time, I'm talking maybe 30s. By that time, I was really getting into the sort of academic study of consciousness. So my interest, I guess. It's not easy to label these things, actually, but in some ways my focus was consciousness studies, and my interests outside of academia were more in the mysticism and spiritual practice. But through our collaboration, I began to see, that there was this whole field of transpersonal psychology, and then when was this? In the sort of late 80s. In the late 80s, I could see that the ground was fertile for bringing those interests of mine together. As I said before, the day job and the night job, as it were. And that's when I wrote my first book, which was exactly that, bringing mysticism and psychology together.
What was the name of that book?
It was called Mind, Brain, and Human Potential.
Oh, right. That was published in 2011. What?
No. That was. I don't know. Maybe it was republished. I don't know. That was published in 1991. So I was writing it in the late 80s.
And then what was the educational institution that you and your friend Mike put together the master's program?
Yeah, it was. Well, it was called Liverpool Polytechnic. I'm trying to think how to explain this. In the UK, we're clearer. So there were these institutions which were called polytechnics, and I think it was in the 1980s or 90s, I can't even remember now exactly, they were allowed to become universities. So I didn't change institution, as it were, but the institution changed. So initially I wasn't in a university, but it became a university.
And did it change its name from Liverpool?
Well, so it was Liverpool Polytechnic, right. And it became Liverpool John Moores University.
Got it.
And actually, that is quite important in this context, interestingly enough, because I think that if I turn the clock back again to my early 20s, I was offered a position in a mainstream university, and I decided against it because at that point I was just finding that mainstream, university psychology was so narrow, and there was no, you couldn't breathe, as it were.
We used to call it rats in cages.
Yeah, well, it was that and cognitive psychology as well. Yes, exactly. And so and at that point I sort of, as I say, I think this was my early 20s, I considered, what did I really want to do? And it wasn't to go down those tram lines, and beaver away into ever narrower ideas. I was interested in the nature of mind, and I wanted a general framework. And it was because this institution was not a university at the time, that I really had that kind of freedom.
Mm.
You know, we were a very small department, so I was teaching lots of different areas. I wasn't really being narrowed down. And I think that was what enabled me eventually to carve out this niche where we were working in transpersonal psychology.
Do you think...
And again, it's worth making the point, and again, the culture is different. UK is different from the States, other countries, and so on. But I think it's worth making the point that this was in a mainstream university. You know, it's not like, I know in the States, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, as was, it's now renamed as Sophia University. Yeah, but that's a specialist institution. So that's fine. I mean, whereas to actually build a kind of a center, a niche in the transpersonal, in the spiritual, in the sort of late in the 90s or whenever it was, within what became a mainstream university, that wasn't so easy. Mm-hmm. So again, that goes back to what you said about challenges.
Did you precede the Edinboro Endowed Chair in Parapsychology? Which came first? Do you know?
Which came first, the Edinboro Chair or
yours, or your program?
Oh Lord, don't know. I think probably the Edinboro one's first. But that's not transpersonal psychology, that's parapsychology. Yeah? I mean, their relationship is different. I mean, I don't regard myself as a parapsychologist. I know that, some people that probably you've been interviewing, they work within parapsychology, and that's great, but that's, I mean, I could explain the reasons and so on, but that's not my primary interest.
Right. You're interested in religion and spirituality and psychology.
And consciousness, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's get to that. Before we get more specific, I wonder what you've experienced personally in terms of transpersonal. I mean, do you write down your dreams? Do you meditate? What's the Kabbalistic spiritual practice that you can use?
So I began meditating again in my early 20s. But what I understand as spiritual practice is complex. I mean, there are meditative practices, there are other kind of, if you like, ritual practices, there are concentrative practices, there are practices to do with how we relate the microcosm and the macrocosm. So it's not there are many dimensions here. In terms of my own experience, but I wouldn't keep doing it if there weren't experiences, obviously. I remember one time, this is going back some way, I was working with people in a group, and one of the things we do in the group is to kind of focus on the heart, right? The sense that the heart opens, the sense that it's more than just, it's not just a physiological organ. And we did a lot of practice to do with this, and I always felt, I mean, this goes with my scientific side in a sense. I remember thinking, okay, well, this is kind of a bit of imagination. Let's just go with the flow, and it's all right. And and to me, there was nothing really there. And then I remember, again, one of these big memories. I remember when something changed, and I knew, there was great truth, great reality in these traditional teachings, that there's all kinds of centers in the body, and there's an esoteric anatomy. I've had many experiences concerned with that, synchronicities. And I would say the main point of my experience, and I can't, I don't even if I can articulate it, is what is meaning. The sense that everything is meaningful. There's no such thing as chance. And it can sound simplistic, like, fate and destiny and all those things, right? But all that is just recognizing that the quality of meaning is a fundamental reality. That's what I have experienced. It comes out through things like synchronicities, through my sense of what matters in my life, in the people I meet, in what opens up at a particular time. These kinds of things. So it's not simply a question of moments of mindfulness, which of course I've experienced, but it's more than just that. And this is in my writings I've often written. Times have changed so much. When I was writing in the 70s, 80s, 90s, then the notion of spirituality was definitely not part of psychology, but things have very much changed. So there's a lot of interest, as you know, in issues like mindfulness, the psychology, neuroscience of mindfulness, all those areas. But, my particular orientation is to say, well, this is not enough. The danger is that, and it's been, let me get this in perspective actually, the opening up of psychology and other scientific approaches to especially Buddhist meditation has been crucial, and it's really been a sea change, which I embrace, and it's fantastic. But the point I want to make in relation to my experience is that it's not enough. That's the point.
Because you have to think about what you're meditating on, which is
because we're talking about what is real. We're not just talking about, as it were, a state of mindfulness, being a bit more present, being in control of attention, doing things that are more healthy, etc., etc. We're talking about something that I think is much deeper than that. Whether we talk about it as the unconscious psyche, whether we talk about it as the kind of the soul, the spirit, we're talking about something that is hugely formative. And the great spiritual traditions are about those realizations. And the danger, and I think we're moving beyond this now as a culture, actually. But, if we go back, say, 5 years, I think that, as culture and in a subject like psychology, we are embracing only the superficial aspects of what spirituality is about. So my interest is to point towards what I regard as the deeper aspects.
And I think it's interesting that that people say mindfulness now instead of meditation. I think in reaction to fundamentalist Christians who don't like meditation because they think it's Eastern religion and I guess demonic or something. So it's pitched in terms of it will relax you and help with anxiety, and it's not pitched in terms of, well, let's access the deeper source of knowledge or something.
Right. Yeah, it is an interesting subject as to, as it were, the packaging of meditation or mindfulness. And as you say, words are important. I would say that there's meditation in Christianity. Here in the UK, we've got a major organisation promoting Christian meditation, and it's a big organisation, and there's a lot of interest. So this sort of reaction, it's Eastern or whatever, that's nonsense.
And you could look at Catholics saying Hail Mary, Mother of God as a meditation, and Buddhists use prayer beads too. So,
exactly.
You mentioned esoteric physiology. Do you mean auras, chakras, meridians? What do you mean esoteric physiology?
So this goes into my interest in the Kabbalah, and it's like this point about parapsychology. What I've never been interested in, and it's not to say there's anything wrong with it, and on the contrary, I think it's very interesting, but it's not been my bag, as it were, is in trying to, as it was, scientifically demonstrate, telepathy or auras, that kind of thing. So, but what I am interested in is the ideas, the patterns of knowledge. So if you go into the Kabbalah, major 13th century text is talking about aspects of the brain, But they're not talking about it in the way of neuroscience, as it were. They're talking about an esoteric idea. But at the core of those traditions, I mean, I'm talking about the Kabbalah, but it's not just that. You find the same sort of thing in Eastern traditions as well. At the core is this idea of correspondence. So there are levels and levels. And it goes back to what you said about astrology right at the beginning, because that's another manifestation of the same worldview. There's a sort of microcosm and a macrocosm. So, we're talking about deep patterns here. I'm very interested in the idea that there are fundamental patterns. We find it in the mind, like archetypes. We find it in outer reality as well. And I think that that's where esoteric anatomy comes in, because for a discipline like the Kabbalah, the idea is that the organs we have, like the brain, for example, is based on a deeper plan. Now, it's not so difficult to understand in our day, because you can look at it, genetically. I mean, obviously the genes are conveying a pattern, a plan, and biology produces that plan, manifests that plan. The Kabbalists, obviously, they didn't know anything about genes. But they had the same idea. There's a fundamental pattern, and this is unfolding, and that's where their real esoteric studies focus.
Is this similar to the Platonic idea of forms, of ideal forms that are kind of the template?
Yes, it's it's part of this. Kabbalah is very much a Neoplatonic system. Yeah.
And did it begin in the 13th century? The Kabbalistic writers.
Again, how long have we got? It's a very interesting topic. So the term Kabbalah, which comes from a Hebrew root, lakabel, which is to receive, the received tradition, which has got an ambiguity because it means you receive it from a teacher, but also ultimately you receive it directly from wherever, from a deeper source, okay? Anyway, so the term Kabbalah, it comes into being around the 13th century. So we, in a sort of scholarly sense, we identify the Kabbalah, different pronunciations, we identify the Kabbalah with a scheme, a Neoplatonic scheme that really circulates within the 12th and 13th century. The idea of the tree of life, I don't know if you know the pattern of Sephirot, you probably know some of this stuff. So that's a scheme that arrives in published form, or in written form, in the 12th century. Now, so in that academic sense, the term Kabbalah dates from the 12th century. But, and I think this is crucial, and I think this is increasingly recognised in scholarly circles as well, that where do these ideas come from? It wasn't suddenly someone dreamt it up. Oh yeah, in the 12th century, I've got an idea. It's like this. These were intense oral traditions, which you can trace back. And, where did it come from? I think there are interesting arguments to say that some of the fundamental ideas of this strand of mysticism you can trace back to Egyptian culture. One of the things that really interested me, which is actually why the organisation we started is called the Alef Trust, is language and letters. Jewish mysticism is quintessentially a mysticism of language. And that's what, that relates to what I said before about interest in patterns. Language is the biggest pattern-forming tool that we have. And the Kabbalists really penetrated into the structure of language. And so that the Hebrew letters themselves are conveying mystical ideas or esoteric ideas. The letter Aleph.
The same is true for Sanskrit, right?
Yes, exactly. They're sacred languages. That's what we mean by saying they're sacred languages. The letter Aleph has no sound of its own, which is very odd for a letter in a language. So it's silent. It's the first letter. So the idea that, silence is the beginning of everything. But at the same time, if you trace it back, let's say you can trace it to Proto-Sinaitic letters. You can trace it. It's a little bit of controversy here, but you can probably trace it through to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so the Aleph has the connotation of an ox. The hieroglyph was of an ox. And you get it through to the A, our letter, the Roman letter A, has got the horns of the ox, but they're downwards. It's fascinating to look at trace the history of this. So why was the first letter connected with an ox? Well, because it's about the primordial energy of creation. And an ox is a kind of tamed bull. Yeah. And you get the same thing. So that's in the letters. It's in the letters. It's in the language. And what we do at the Alef Trust is very much about understanding about silence, because that's meditative. Everything comes from a kind of void. At the same time, to understand that huge energy, the energy of creativity, the energy of creation, and how we channel that and work with that in ritual, in imagery.
In the beginning was the word.
Absolutely, yeah.
And
that point about the ox, in Zen you get a real interesting parallel, because there's what are called the ox herding images. I don't know if you come across that. So there's a set of images. It's one of a major sort of teaching tradition. It goes back to Taoism as well. The images are, the monk first seeing a bull and going to try and capture it and tame it, etc. It's a series of images which you can look it up on the web, and they are, they're metaphorical of our journey as spiritual beings.
I wonder if it's related to yoga, meaning yoke, because oxen are yoked.
These all link. They all intersect, don't they? Because it's what I said before about patterns. These are the fundamentals of the human condition. What my work, I'm a psychologist, but what really interests me and fires me up are these fundamentals of the human condition, and how we reach our potential, how we engage with a richer way of being, and crucially the consequence of that for what we do to ourselves, to each other, to our world, to our environment. These are the things that are important.
Mm-hmm. In terms of your neurophysiology, the science in the lab kind of work, what have you chosen to study? Traditionally, I think people study NDEs, or they study what happens to the brain in meditation. What have you been interested in from the physiological point of view?
Right. So, going back some time, my research was on the hemispheres of the brain, the relationship between left and right. That was with experimental research, but also working with brain damaged patients and looking at the consequence of left-sided damage or right-sided damage. So that was my kind of schooling in active research. But most of my published work now is not so much that kind of research. I'm much more interested in building models of the nature of mind, understanding the relationship between, let's say, spiritual, mystical ideas about the way in which the mind works, and relating those and building them further by relating them to cognitive and neuroscientific material. So I think I need to say an example. It's a bit abstract. One of the areas that I write about is the Buddhist Abhidharma tradition. This is the wisdom literature in the Theravada tradition of Buddhism. And one part of the Abhidharma, this wisdom literature, is discussing what they call the thought process and the sense thought process. So this is, in modern terminology, this is an analysis of perception, how we perceive. And the Abhidharma identifies different moments, different, as it were, processes through which we come to see the world, perception. So I analysed what they're saying about these different stages or moments in relation to what's going on with neuroscience and how we can understand that there are very interesting parallels between the two. Of course, the difference is that the Abhidharma is coming from introspective experience, and these are the experiences of monks who delve deeply through meditation and other practices. So it's sort of the first person understanding. That means sort of introspective, my mind, what's going on in my mind, versus the third person, which is from the outside looking in, as it were, which is obviously what neuroscience is. So yeah, that's my research. It's not, as I say, in my early work, I was doing the more traditional approach to research, which is saying, okay, let's put an electrode here, let's work out let's scan the brain, let's do all that stuff. But now that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is looking at the models in order to understand both. So models coming from esoteric or spiritual traditions, and looking at those through the lens of psychology.
So in approaches to consciousnness, the marriage of science and mysticism, give us an example of the marriage of science and mysticism.
Well, an example is exactly, well, let me just step back. That's why that is the title, right? Because that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm trying to, it's not just, okay, I'll give you an example, but let's just say it like this. A lot of research in the area of spirituality and psychology is about one side trying to prove itself against the other side. So let's say, a neuroscientist who's interested in someone who's been meditating for 10 years, sticks the electrodes on or puts them in an MRI scan, whatever it is, and says, oh yeah, okay, well they're meditating and this is the pattern of brain activity. So what? You could say, so what? I mean, of course, whatever we do, there's going to be a pattern of brain activity, right? So, it's interesting. It shows that 10 years of meditation brings about certain changes, which is interesting, and so on. So, I'm not knocking it, but there's a limit to what you can achieve through that. Okay, but I think that's the traditional view of research. So, really, it's the neuroscientist trying to fit the spiritual change into the parameters of science. So if the Buddhist monk says, I'm a reincarnation of some other being, I mean, the scientist isn't going to say, oh yes, I can study that. Of course I can't study that, really. Yeah. So what's happening is it's being fitted into the sort of basically materialist vision of mainstream science. Okay, so that's not what I'm doing. That's why it's a marriage. A marriage is a mutual respect, and it's generative, it's creative, right? So the point of what I'm doing is to say, okay, well, the Buddhists, for example, the one I've just been talking about, the Buddhists had great insight into these miniature, micro processes that are going on. Right? The Buddhist texts say that these moments of consciousness, thousands of them happen in one lightning flash. So in other words, they're really, really, you wouldn't normally be aware of them. And that's exactly what when we're studying what's going on in the brain, that's also what we're doing. So I think it's a more generative way of working to bring these two together and say, okay, what kind of new hypotheses can we generate? What arises from looking at changes in the brain from understanding the introspective accounts of these monks who were really the great artisans of understanding the minutiae of mind. So that's one area, as you said, for examples. The other exact area, which we talked about the Kabbalah before, so that comes very much into the book, and there's all kinds of ways in which there's a sort of integration, marriage, integration, whatever words we want to use. So, for example, I been very interested. You asked before about esoteric anatomy. So the way in which a 13th century text is talking about the brain, how does that relate to what we know from contemporary neuroscience? And that, what I demonstrate is there are relationships. It's a bit complex to go into, but the patterns of activity, the functional relationships within regions of the brain that we know about today from neuroscience, we can see that in let's say a 13th century text, there are similarities in the patterns of those relationships. Mm. The classic example with left and right. So we know there's left hemisphere, there's right hemisphere, and there's a relationship between them. Okay, and they each has a distinctive quality. So in the Kabbalah, in the whole scheme, left and right are very important, and left and right have qualities, and those left and right qualities seem to correspond at a generic level to what we find in contemporary neuroscience understanding of left and right. So it suggests to me, and these 13th century mystics, they weren't sort of probing the brain with electrodes or whatever, of course, but they did have insight in their own terms into the patterns of which the universe is created. That's what the Kabbalah is all about. So it seems to me that, and you'd have to read the book to go into the detail, but it seems to me that you can argue, and I argue, that contemporary neuroscience reveals patterns in the relationships in the brain that seem to recapitulate the kinds of patterns that these Kabbalists were talking about, which, if you get into their mindset, is not strange, because they one of the key points of their mindset is this idea of esoteric anatomy we talked about before. That the below reflects the above, as above, so below, which is a classic statement, yeah? There's a pattern. That's what they believed. There was a pattern. Obviously, they thought of it in divine terms. Whether we use the, way we think about it in divine terms is another whole question. But they thought that there was a fundamental pattern on which all things were structured. And that pattern is, as it were, the pattern of the Godhead, the divine itself, as it were. And because that's a fundamental pattern, our bodies resonate with that pattern. That's what, that's almost the whole of the Kabbalah in a nutshell in some ways.
So
right?
it's a hologram in a way.
Well, you could use that term. They didn't talk about it in those terms, obviously. But yes, there's a pattern, and all things reflect that pattern. Another modern term would be a holarchy. So that's one of the terms used. So that yes. I mean, that's part of the process. What you just said is to look at the terms that are current today. I think that's a lot of what my work is, to look at these ancient systems, which I think are incredibly insightful. I mean, most, especially most scientists, I would say, just they're, at the best they're quaint. But I think there's some real insights. The same with the Buddhist stuff, of course, that's the point. I see that there's great insights there. I know they're great insights because I work with these systems. I practice these systems. I understand their depths. It's not just kind of fancy words. It's not just poetic. So, and so my work, I think, is to say, okay, well, within the framework that they were establishing, how does that framework pan out today? And if it relates, let's say in the way I said, that understanding the brain in terms of left, right, or higher and lower processing, or whatever it is, if that relates to the patterns that they were working with, what does that imply? And I think the implications are very, very interesting. I mean, okay, firstly, it implies that there's kind of some substance behind what they were working with, which is interesting in itself. But much more important, I think, is the implications in terms of what it means for our aspirations. Because, I mean, I think this is where science is really changing. We're entering a new paradigm, and people would say. The notion of the detached scientist, and even more important, the kind of detached theory. I can have a theory about the brain, and it's like a computer, or and there's nothing, there's no consciousness. It's just a kind of illusion or whatever. Now, we have to think about the implications of those theories. If our theories of consciousness suggest that there's nothing beyond mechanism, then that's what we will create ourselves as. And it's happening. I mean, that is happening today. And I think that we have a huge responsibility. Scientists have a huge responsibility to consider the value, the moral implications of theories. And again, that's what I say in relation to a tradition like Kabbalah, but it's true of all the spiritual traditions. They were moral theories. I don't mean morality in the simple sense of do this and don't do that. I mean in the sense of encouraging a sense of meaning, purpose, of value, that we are beings with direction, and the universe is not simply a random, aimless entity. That's what's important. And that's what psychology needs to understand.
Just a couple of questions about the left-right brain hemispheres. Do you think yin, the Chinese concept, is kind of like right brain, and yang is kind of like the left brain, or is that stretching it too much?
Well, I'm going to evade it slightly, okay? Not because there is a danger of just sort of hanging something here and hanging something there. I think the point is what I'm saying is that there is a fundamental understanding of right and left. That's what yin and yang is about. Polarity. Everything is based in polarity. And, and in that sense, the brain reflects a deeper pattern. That's the point I'm making. So yes, there is a relationship.
And then I've read that women tend to have more integration through the corpus callosum, so there's more connection between the left, and men are more specialized in their brain hemisphere. Is that accurate?
That seems, that's one of the theories, and it makes some sense. It's kind of evolutionary couched theory in terms of what were the functions in sort of primitive Stone Age societies, etc. The hunter-gatherer. So there was the skills of the right hemisphere in terms of spatial relationships were more important for the males, and linguistic, maybe more important for the women in terms of establishing society, family, etc. Again, I think all these theories are interesting. It's what I said before. I want to look upwards rather than downwards. How can I put it? That, of course we're the product of our history, in the sense of the evolutionary instincts we have. But say, okay, well, the male brain is organised in this way, and the female brain is organised in that way because of certain roles we had in evolution. Fine, okay, and we carry that within us, but let's look forward, let's move forward. And I think, again, that's what I see in the more esoteric traditions. A bit like, the really obvious parallel here is Jung's treatment of alchemy, so, the thrust of Jung's work, and Jung, of course, is in this area, sort of visionary and understanding the sort of spiritual nature of humankind and so on. Jung's obviously a luminary, crucial. And so much of what he was able to achieve was really about translating these great truths of an esoteric tradition, which was alchemy in his case, and Kabbalah, because there was a huge connection there actually, to translate that into terminology that makes sense, or is at least usable in a 20th century context.
He also said that Western culture suffers because it's been so male-dominated, and the archetype of the Great Mother and the feminine has been denigrated. And I think I hear people talking about now there's more of an upwelling of this female, more integrative big picture thing.
There's no question about that. We live in interesting times. And I think that there's no question that, you know, some phenomena are of the nature of fashion. You know, here this day, gone tomorrow, that kind of thing, right? The rise of the feminine is not of that nature. The rise of the feminine in our age, you know, which I mean we're talking about 100 years actually. I mean, it's not just something that's happening right now, as it were. But you know, the rise of the feminine is a major rebalancing of culture, of the psyche. And yes, Jung, I mean, the reason why Jung was aware of this is because he understands the dynamics of the psyche. That, for example, you know, the anima and the animus, and then again, these are archetypes. What they mean is a longer subject. And I mean, an interesting one to come to one of my interests, which is the Kabbalah, which we talked about. You know, these, if I'm looking back to 12th, 13th century, these are incredibly male-oriented texts. You know, they weren't written for women, and so they have, you know, there is a time and place and a culture, and it doesn't gel with our day. And I think, you know, I'm quite, in some ways, I'm quite a traditionalist as well as being into modern science. But you know, I'm quite a traditionalist in, you know, I think that some of the older rituals can be very powerful, and you know, we sort of dilute them at our peril, that kind of thing. But I would say that the one thing that is changing in our day is exactly this: the relationship. And I don't just mean women and men. I'm really talking about the qualities of the psyche, actually.
The animus.
But it manifests in terms of things in the outer world, in terms of women asserting themselves, etc. Of course, but you know, it's the balancing of the psyche and in the soul, actually. And so I think that, you know, as far as the Kabbalah is concerned, a real challenge for us today, which many are meeting. A real challenge is to understand the ways in which what was a very strongly male-dominated tradition can come alive in our culture, recognizing the role of the feminine. The role of the feminine was always there. There's a concept, I don't know if you come across, of the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah, yeah, is the feminine dimension of the divine. And I mean, we were talking about the history of Kabbalah a while back. You raised a question, and I said, okay, well, the scheme that comes in the 12th century, 12th, 13th, that's what we call the Kabbalah, right? One of the defining hallmarks of that period, and it was quite new actually in that period, I would say, was this notion of the feminine divine. Mm. And again, everything has a historical connection, so that it had a relationship to the cult of Mary in Christianity around the same time. It manifested in very different ways, so you know, we weren't going down that road. It's an interesting subject, actually. But the point I'm making is that, you know, the rise of the feminine, we find it in different ways historically. It's like the 13th century, 12th, 13th century was a forerunner, just like the Renaissance was a forerunner of our contemporary Renaissance. So, you know, the notion that there's a feminine quality to the divine, and mysticism revolves very strongly around that feminine quality, that came strongly in the 13th century. But I think it didn't flower in the right way. It flowered within a very male-dominated.
Which took away women's sexuality, because you
Absolutely.
Could be virgin or whore.
Especially the cult of Mary did that. Not so much the Shekhinah. I mean, the Kabbalah is a very, its symbolism is strongly sexualized, whereas Christianity took away the sexual dimension, which again is a very interesting subject in its own right about the dynamic between Judaism and Christianity. But what I'm saying is that it flowered in that period, but it didn't flower in a way which respected as it were, real women or the real feminine quality in the psyche. And I think, it's sort of flowered and then, as it were, went underground and it's coming out in our day. So, it's like saying that there's a new Renaissance, and there was a Renaissance in the 15th century, whatever, and, and then that spirit kind of got subdued, and then it's coming back in our day.
What's interesting to me about Trump is that he seems to be the archetype of the negative, animus, masculine. He's like the worst of any male traits he's got. So my hope is that he's kind of bringing this into the light so people can say, oh, no more.
Well, it's like the whole thing about birth pangs, isn't it? There's trauma. Change is associated with trauma. And let's hope it's not too painful.
Are you hopeful in the face of the autocrats around the world and climate change and global warming and growing inequality that we'll make it? The human beings will make it?
Well, maybe we will and maybe we won't, right? In the larger scale of things, I think the as it were, planetary consciousness will find its way. I think it's almost a kind of conceit to think that we're pulling all those strings. We're not. There's more to it than that, I think. But let me answer your question. Yes, I'm an optimist. There are all kinds of things going on. You talk about Trump. I could tell you about what's going on in this country with Brexit. So, we're going through our traumas. And, is it the right movement? I don't want to get into politics, but, the idea that we should be a smaller place rather than a larger place, is that part of globalization? So, we can raise a lot of questions. So it's not a bed of roses by any means. And I think you are seeing, the way I see Brexit, actually, it's very much to do with an antiquated political system. It's really about, again, all these subjects we speak so long about, but what is the nature of democracy? Yeah. So, generally we elect representatives and we say, okay, you know what you're doing, get on with it. And then suddenly we realise, well, they don't know what to do. So how do we have a democratic voice? So, the case of Brexit is we say, okay, well, everyone can vote. It's not just the MPs. Yeah, everyone's going to vote. So we have a referendum. And is that the answer? And maybe, the problem with the referenda is that people are swung too easily. So there's the influence of propaganda.
And the Russians were involved in that too, right?
It seems to be the case, and it's insidious. There are many things about our world in the area of politics and in the area of global companies, etc. All that stuff, hugely insidious. I don't think there's any question about that. Am I an optimist? Yes. Why? Because of the things we've been talking about. I think that what is happening on a serious scale in our day is a resurgence of spirituality. But what does that mean? Of understanding that there is the beyond the material. Yeah, that's this sort of movement towards non-material science. What does it mean to talk about transcendent states? And I think this is changing. This is changing. What has changed, actually, it's changed the nature of science. There's no question. It hasn't changed it enough, perhaps, but the sense of moral responsibility for climate, responsibility for other areas of the globe far away from where you are. These are very real in our day, and I think that's very. There are optimistic signs. Yeah, okay, so I'm a glass half full kind of person, and yes, of course, there are really big issues, and we can easily blow ourselves up. ruin, you can decimate the forests. All kinds of terrible things are happening. But I think that, what interests me, I am interested in those, I'm very worried about those. But bottom line, in relation to things we're talking about, is the resurgence of the human spirit. And I think that we're seeing in our day.
Well, you seem more optimistic than what I see in terms of science changing, because everybody that I've talked with has resistance and feels like they have to be kind of quiet if they work in a established university and not at IONS or Sophia or something like that. Garrett Modell he does applied physics at University of Colorado, and he proposed a course where they would do psi research, and it was very difficult, but kind of like your experience. They hassled him, but they said, okay, go ahead and do it, because it's just a special course offered every 3 years or so. But what evidence do you have that really science has changed?
Firstly, the things we've talked about, the interest in meditation, the interest in compassion, for example. I think that there are serious. It's not just a sort of blip, I think there's a very serious groundswell of interest in spiritual values and spiritual practices that has influenced the academy. It's not just a question of will we have a course on this, will we have a bit of research going into that. It's a question of that human face. I think that the universities are they're taking a different direction than they were taking. I mean, there are some areas that are getting ridiculous. Like, there's a real question around free speech where sometimes take climate change. If someone has a view, which may be, there are views, they could have a view which may be informed that climate change is not due to human interference. That's a legitimate position. I don't think it's a majority position. I think there is evidence to argue against it, but so often these people aren't even allowed to speak. So, so you can look at two ways. One, free speech is under pressure, but on the other hand, some of the values that are directing the direction these things are going on are expressions, positive expressions of human spirit. Parapsychology, right? Yes, of course. I'm not living with my head in the sand. I know that there are many people who argue that, a study that seems to show beyond statistical doubt that there's some kind of telepathic influence or whatever, and someone will come along and sort of say, well, what about this factor? What about that factor? And, and it's just nonsense. And it's driven, that kind of criticism is driven not by the real, the particular factors in that sense. It's driven by a worldview. And that's the worldview of materialist science. But I'm saying that there are huge signs that worldview is under threat. So, for example, my area, consciousness. The idea that you could that consciousness may not be something generated by material processes. In other words, the fundamental things is matter. So we have a particular form of matter, we call it the brain, and this particular form of matter generates something else, which is called consciousness. All right? Now, that view is strongly under threat, and many mainstream scientists are now moving to the direction of saying, well, what about if we suggest that consciousness is a fundamental property? It's not produced by matter or force or these things. It's a fundamental property of the universe. So everything in the universe, in a sense, is pervaded by, I think I would say, proto-consciousness rather than consciousness. But that's a particular nuance of meaning. Now, many people in the scientific world are articulating those kinds of views. So there is change.
I looked at the University of California at Santa Cruz because they have a history of consciousness program, and it's the only one that I've heard of in the UC system. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I looked at the components of their program, and there was sociological. There was nothing about the transpersonal or psi phenomena or spirituality, nothing like that.
Well, clearly the US university system is behind where we are in this country. No, I said that facetiously.
No, I think that's true.
I'm running a course in which, it's the course I'm running through the Alef Trust and the Ph.D. work through the Alef Trust. This is, this is validated through the university system. And then when I put my proposals together, I'm saying, well, one view. Of course, I'm not just saying consciousness is the ultimate reality and everything else is nonsense. It's a question of balance. I'm saying there are many views about the nature of consciousness. One of those views, which is certainly gathering momentum, is the notion of consciousness as some kind of fundamental reality. And what's the evidence for that? What are the implications of that? It's an academic way of looking at it. But of course, there's a practical side to it as well, and that is that many would articulate that accords with their experience. There is cosmic consciousness. What is going? Is that just illusion? Someone feels that they are, in a sense, in tune with the larger whole. Millions of people are articulating that kind of a vision. Mm-hmm. It's not a small movement. Mm-hmm. No, they might say it within the context of traditional religion, or they might say it within the context of sort of transpersonal psychology. I think things are changing.
Mm. You teach for Sophia in the Bay Area in California?
I have done. I ran. I was involved with Ph.D. students at Sophia, and then I ran a course on consciousness at CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies.
And that became Sophia, right?
No. They're two different institutions.
Are you sure? Okay.
Yeah. There was the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto. That became Sophia University.
Okay.
But there's another organization called the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is based in San Francisco.
And they both focus on what? They're unusual universities.
Yes. You'd have to ask them, but Sophia, Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, focus on transpersonal psychology, obviously in its title. It's changed somewhat over recent years, so it became what's now called Sophia University. And the teaching of transpersonal psychology, I think, is not so strong there now. The CIIS it promotes a range of areas, not just transpersonal psychology. That's one of them. East-West psychology and other aspects of contemporary thinking in consciousness research.
So again, let me ask you if you know of any other programs that offer these consciousness masters or whatever besides what you're doing.
Well, the places we just mentioned.
Yeah, and Steve Taylor.
Sorry?
Steve Taylor, I think, offers a program.
Steve Taylor works with us at the Alef Trust. Steve Taylor, he studied with me. When I was talking about Liverpool John Moores University, he studied on the program I was running there, and he now has a position at another university, Leeds Beckett University in the UK, but he also teaches part-time on the program that we're running through the Alef Trust. So that's another university, Leeds Beckett in the UK. They do a course. It's not called transpersonal psychology, but they bring aspects of the transpersonal into it. There's the University of West Georgia. They bring in There's a number of different universities which have some of these courses. Yes.
Mm-hmm. But I know West Georgia, I think, is just one woman. I don't think it's anybody
Christine.
else. Christine Simmons Moore, yeah. Do you
Yeah,
know?
she studied with me as well.
Oh.
She studied when she was living in Liverpool before she went to America. And she studied again on the program I was running at Liverpool John Moores University. So it's a small world, but we're growing.
But what I was surprised is it seemed to all kind of start in Edinboro, but now not much is happening there. I tried to get Christine Watts to be interviewed, and she said no.
Oh, really? Well, there you are. Yeah, but again, I would make a distinction between parapsychology itself. So, you know, that in other words, parapsychology is really about, you know, good quality, high quality methodological studies, research to demonstrate these phenomena. So that's one thing. But transpersonal psychology, although it does connect, there's no question about that, and transpersonal psychology is much more about understanding the mind, you know, and understanding the mind with a view to the ways in which we can grow, you know, in the sense of sort of spiritual or, you know, psychological growth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think I have to ask you to define consciousness.
I don't think you can define consciousness. Consciousness is, in that there are many ways we can, you know, kind of penetrate into what it is. But I don't know that we can actually define it. It's like if I said to you, what's matter? Yeah? You can't, you know, the fundamental quality you can't, because normally when we define things, we try and define something in terms of something else. That's, you know, I say, what's a table? Define a table. So you say, oh, well, it's got a function. You know, you can put things on it, or it's made of wood, or this, that, and the other. So it's like, what's its function, and what's it made of? So if something is not made of anything else, you can't define it in that way. Do you see what I mean? So then you can say, well, what's its function? And there's a lot of discussion around what is the function of consciousness? It's not a simple question. My own view, and it might sound sort of trite in a way, but you know, I've looked into this over many, many years. My own view is that consciousness, its function is to do with transformation. Consciousness is about relating to a higher level of being. Consciousness has different aspects or dimensions to it. The core aspect is experience. Not necessarily experience of this, that, or the other, just the fact that there is experience. Technically, we use the word phenomenality to cover that, or qualia. So the essence of consciousness is to do with the fact that there is experience, which you cannot explain in any other way. You know, you can say, oh, well, why do you have experiences? Oh, because of what the brain's doing. Not necessarily. You know, what the brain's doing may be important in shaping what the content of experiences, but the fact that you have experience is not explained by the brain. So that's the first point about defining consciousness. The second point concerns what we call intentionality. So experience is pure. There may be not even, it's like what I said about the letter Alef. It's the first, it's the beginning, it's just silent, it has no content, as it were. So there may be just that fundamental experience, or some people call pure consciousness. But then, if you're talking about consciousness in the way that most cognitive scientists are talking about it, you have to bring in the notion of intentionality. That is, that consciousness is about something. So if I say to you that, okay, at this moment in time, what are you conscious of? You're hearing my voice, you're thinking about any other question. So, you know, there's contents there. So that's another aspect of consciousness, but it's not the definition, because that doesn't convey the point about experience. You know, I mean, a computer could have content. I mean, you know, a computer, it has memory and it has processing and it's working with content. It's simple, right? But does it have experience? Well, I don't know because I'm not inside it. I can't know.
Well,
So
the random number generators respond to human intention, so there's some reactive quality of those machines.
Well, that's a slightly different point. That's the point about psychokinesis, right? So, what I would say, and again, this goes back to sort of the patterns that I'm interested in, as it were, that at a deep level, matter and mind are not separate. I think that's the point. But again, it's a different subject. But, coming back to consciousness, I mean, obviously that does relate to consciousness. But so consciousness is the medium through which all connects, right? So if the random number generator is responding to intention, then the medium for that to occur is through consciousness. But the final point about consciousness is that there's a sort of mundane, immediate aspect. I mean, if I say, what's going on in your mind right now? So you say, okay, well, I'm hearing your voice. I'm thinking about the questions. So there's that sort of immediate content. But there's something else, and that's the sense of I. What in my book I call this the I narrative. Not EYE, but capital I. In other words, there is a sense of being a being in control. Spiritual traditions will suggest to us, and I think quite rightly, that we're not as much in control as we think we are. But the immediate mundane experience, I'm not talking about high spiritual states, the immediate mundane is this the sense of I. So again, when I say to you what's going on right now, you're hearing my voice, you're thinking about the questions, etc., etc. But it's all happening in relation to your sense of yourself. Mm-hmm. You're the one running the interview. Mm-hmm. And it has a sort of narrative. Why are you doing it? Because I'm writing a book, because I want to do X, Y, and Z. So there's a whole narrative being constructed. And so that's another dimension of consciousness. So in my book, obviously it's a book about consciousness, so I deal with this question of definition, and I break it down into these different dimensions.
Mm-hmm. In some place you write about the multiple brain, and I was curious what that is.
So a really important question is to do with unification. All right? So how is it that my experience of consciousness, or my experience as a conscious being, is of a unified reality? Yeah? So, I don't wake up in the morning and kind of have to start thinking all over again of who I am. It's there, it clicks into place. And so too in a sort of moment-to-moment sense, we know a lot of what the brain is doing. So, for example, in relation to perception, one part might be, let's say, vision. So one part of the brain is responding to the wavelength of light, colour. Another part of the brain is responding to movement. Another part of the brain may be specialised with looking at faces and conceptualising faces. So all these things are happening. But how do they come together? Because when I see you, I don't sort of think, oh yes, there's a bit of colour here, and she's nodding her head. There's movement, and it's not like that, right? So it all comes in now. That's a big question we don't really understand. So we know a lot about all the different parts and how their functions, but how it all comes together is not an easy question to answer. So in that sense, it's in that sense that we can talk in neuroscience about multiple. I mean, multiple brain is a kind of, it's just a way of putting it in a sense, but there are multiple processes in the brain and we're not quite sure how they are integrated. That's one point. And of course, that parallels the more psychological phenomena where, how integrated actually are we? So, I mean, obviously there are cases of dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality, where clearly the person is not so integrated. Many people who research this area will say that, they're not just there, that it's not that abnormal, that we're all, even the most well-adapted of us, in a sense, there are diverse aspects to ourselves, that we are, there's a dissociative dimension in what we experience.
I agree.
So, I mean, this comes out in therapy and areas like that. So, it's a question of the level of analysis. Looking at the brain is one level of analysis. We say, okay, the brain, in some way, is multiple, and that multiple things are going on, and we don't really know how it's integrated. That's an interesting question. That's one level. Then there's another level, which is the psychological level, which is to say, we have a unified kind of experience. We have a sense that I am someone. I'm not different people. I'm one person. But actually, maybe that is just a mask which is generated. And, there are different sub-personalities, as sometimes called, different eyes. And, hopefully it all works together, but sometimes it breaks down. So there are different levels, and then you could look at another level, which is the sort of soul level. Again, from my interest in mysticism, one of the central ideas in the Kabbalah, and of course it's in other traditions as well, is the idea of unification. That, the objective of mystical practice is to achieve union. And that it doesn't just mean having this very nice experience where it seems like I'm merging with the universe. I mean, you can get that with LSD or whatever. It doesn't just mean that. It means, I think, in a very profound way, that one is part of a cosmic process which is moving towards unity, unification. It's a kind of divine process. So, do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
There are levels of analysis. And this idea of dissociation versus coming together or integration is part of that pattern. We can see it at the brain level, we see it at the psychological level, we see it at the kind of spiritual soul level. Mm-hmm. And that relates to what I said earlier about these patterns. There are correspondences across different levels.
Mm-hmm. And in some ways some could equate that with God. God is that kind of intelligence and order.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. The question is, what do we mean by using the word God? And the idea that there is meaning in the cosmos, the idea that there is, in a sense, intelligence. I think that's a very liberating way of seeing things, I think, and it's valid. But what it means in terms of the sort of the historical associations, even the baggage, let's say, that's another matter. The wars have been fought over different gods and all that. So we need to move into the global age.
Mm-hmm.
Just to say on that, I think it's important. A very critical question for science and psychology, I think, in our day, is how we understand the notion of transcendence. Because, obviously, in traditional religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, God is the label we give to that which is transcendent. And in our day, I think we're struggling to understand transcendence there's a sense of transcending the ego, the I, there's that sense of it. So there's a psychological meaning to transcendence. But what about the ontology of transcendence? What is real? And I think that's something that penetrates into the quest to have a sort of scientific paradigm which goes beyond a material framework. It's not just materialistic. So something beyond the material realm. I think that's what characterizes the sort of new paradigm, as it were.
Mm. Before we end, I wanted to ask you about the Sacred Wisdoms Archive. What have you put together there?
This is, I think this is to do with the Sacred Science Circle, isn't it? Sometimes I forget these things. So I'm working with.
I think it's part of the sacred.
This is some work I'm doing. So with another colleague, Rosemary Anderson, who actually was at ITP or Sophia University. We mentioned that before, and so we developed the Sacred Science Circle, which is, I mean, it's in the word, right? To understand that science is part of a sacred quest. I think actually you quoted something back to me in your email. You probably got it there. What was it?
All science quests to discern the patterns and forces that lie beyond what is immediately apparent. Such quests become sacred when undertaken in a spirit of reverence, embarking on a journey of transformation.
Exactly. So, so Rosemary and I really think that science is part of this quest, and so just like we talked about alchemy. Alchemy was a science, not in the modern sense, but it was a science. The Kabbalah was an esoteric science as well. Islam, there was huge areas of science within Islam. So the sacred wisdom, it's to try to pull together the insights from these different traditions relating to science and how we update that into modern science. I think
the format is an internet, like a resource bank, or what?
Yes, it's an archive. It's an archive. So we've established a sacred science service. It's very recent, so I think just a year ago or something like that. Rosemary's done a lot of work on research methods in transpersonal psychology. So it's about understanding the way we do research. It can be sacred in its own way. It's not, again, it's what we said before, sticking a Buddhist monk into a magnetic resonance chamber and seeing what pattern comes in the brain. That is not sacred science, right? That's just ordinary science. But sacred science is saying, what is the thrust towards transformation, to achieving higher goals? How can my research contribute to those kind of higher aims? That's sacred science. And so, the archive is about seeing the ways in which that is manifesting, how we draw on things from the past and how that manifests in our day.
So if someone wanted to look at it, they'd go to www.sacredsciencecircle.org.
Exactly, and we just put out our latest newsletter, so there's obviously a mailing list and that kind of thing.
Oh, good. And Alef Trust is ALEF. So
ALEF, yes.
Is there anything else that you would like people to know who are listening or reading about your work or this work?
I think we covered it. Yeah.
Okay.